The addition of synthetic vitamins to flour was a documented scientific achievement. It became a standard, unremarkable step in industrial baking. The subtle shift in nutritional balance took years to manifest in population health data. This intervention was merely the first in a series of quiet substitutions. What replaced real food didn't arrive overnight. It moved in gradually, through packaging that stayed bright under fluorescent lights, through products that lasted months without spoiling, through promises printed in bold letters on boxes that filled entire supermarket aisles. By the mid-1970s, the transformation was already well underway. Most families didn't recognize it as a transformation at all. It looked like convenience. It looked like progress. It looked like the natural evolution of feeding a household. The language used to sell these changes was never about replacement. It was about enhancement, fortification, enrichment, words that suggested addition rather than substitution. Bread in plastic bags wasn't marketed as different. It was the same thing, but better, more consistent, more reliable, safer. The implication was clear. What came before had been inadequate. Television commercials showed mothers serving brightly colored cereals to children in morning light. The mothers looked confident. The children looked healthy. The products were presented not as industrial output, but as expressions of care. A box of something processed and sweetened became a reasonable foundation for a child's day. And because everyone saw the same commercials, bought the same products, it reinforced itself. This was what normal looked like. The speed of adoption was remarkable, but it felt like keeping up. There was no widespread debate. Nutrition science was presented as settled. Fat was bad. Fiber was good. Vitamins were essential, and if they came from a laboratory, that was fine, perhaps preferable. The science said so. The transition wasn't uniform. It moved fastest where time was scarce. In homes with 2 working parents, in schools serving hundreds quickly, in hospitals feeding the sick from the same industrial supply chains. The companies behind this were giants, with research budgets rivaling universities and advertising shaping culture itself. Their products arrived with endorsements from dental associations, partnerships with sports leagues, sponsorships in schools. The message, these are not just products, these are solutions for the responsible family. Nutritional guidelines reflected a reductive view. Food was fuel, a delivery system for compounds, calories, protein, vitamins. The idea that food's form might matter was sidelined. Recommendations needed to be simple and enforceable, aligning with what industry could produce at scale. The logic was elegant. If the body needs certain nutrients and we can synthesize them, then we can engineer products to deliver exact needs. No waste, no guesswork, no variation. It made sense on paper, in labs, in boardrooms. Whether it made sense inside human bodies would take decades to answer. Children growing up then had no baseline for comparison. A lunch of mass-produced snack cakes, fruit-flavored drinks, and bread that didn't mold was simply lunch. The predictability wasn't strange. Strangeness requires contrast, and the contrast was disappearing. The real impact appeared years later, not from any single product, but in broader patterns, in how bodies developed, in appetite regulation, in which flavors felt normal. By the time researchers noticed, the habits were set, in individuals, supply chains, school budgets, and family routines. Someone raised concerns earlier. Nutritionists outside the mainstream, researchers with inconvenient findings, doctors noting puzzling patient declines. But they were scattered, underfunded, and arguing against something invisible through its ubiquity. You can't warn about something everyone eats without immediate harm. The argument was hard because effects weren't absolute. They were subtle, cumulative, intertwined with genetics and lifestyle. Without a straight line from cause to effect, the default was to assume safety. The products were legal, sold in trusted stores. If something was wrong, surely someone official would say so. But officials worked with information shaped by the same industries. Research funding came from companies with vested interests. Advisory boards included food executives. Regulators operated with limited power, relying on self-reporting from those they oversaw. It wasn't simple corruption, it was structural. A system where protectors depended on cooperation from those who might be causing harm. The public narrative was about science and progress. The private reality was about profit margins, shelf stability, reducing labor costs, and engineering brain reward for repeat purchases. These weren't secrets, they just weren't part of the public conversation. The visual language of health was carefully maintained. Packaging with wheat fields and sunshine, commercials with athletes and smiling children, labels with natural and wholesome, terms with no legal definition but deep emotional resonance. They suggested continuity with an imagined past while representing a radical break. It wasn't entirely false. Fortification solved deficiency diseases like rickets and scurvy. But these genuine successes became justification for the entire system, extending to areas with no link to health, only profitability. By the 1980s, this way of eating was so entrenched that alternatives required justification. The default was industrial, appearing in ads, schools, hospitals, and vending machines. Questioning it felt like questioning reality. The companies weren't conspiring. They were doing business, responding to incentives, maximizing shareholder value, operating within the law. Unintended consequences were regrettable but hard to prove and not their legal responsibility. Consequences appeared quietly, in clinics, schools, in the normalization of childhood metabolic and behavioral issues. It couldn't be traced cleanly. Food was one variable among many. Environment, genes, screen time, stress, easy to dismiss as not the main thing. Public health campaigns focused on the individual: eat less, exercise more, choose low fat. The problem was framed as personal failing, bad choices, lack of willpower. This framing avoided the central question: what if the choices available were the problem? What if navigating an environment saturated with engineered foods was impossible even with perfect willpower? Food engineering became a sophisticated science. Companies knew exactly how salt, sugar, and fat overrode satiety. They understood mouthfeel, crunch, and the precise point of maximum appeal. This was funded, deliberate research to make products difficult to stop eating. It was all legal. Safety standards focused on acute harm, poisons, contamination, not on a lifetime of consumption. Those questions were considered too complex, expensive, and disruptive. The pattern continued. Each year brought new products, flavors, formats, a supermarket showcase of chemical engineering. Variety was an illusion. Underlying it was the same few industrially processed ingredients. Families adapted. Kitchens had more storage for packages, less space for preparation. Cooking skills atrophied. What grandmother made from scratch, mother bought pre-made, and daughter didn't recognize as homemade. The loss was comprehensive. Not just recipes, but the understanding of food as something you could have a direct relationship with. Insurance companies saw rising costs and earlier chronic diseases. The expenses were systemic, unsustainable, yet challenging the food system meant confronting an economic and political behemoth. Doctors were trapped. They could prescribe medication and dietary changes, but not a different food system. They worked within the constraints of an environment designed to encourage the very behaviors making patients sick. Independent, long-term diet studies were small and underfunded. Industry-funded research was abundant and reassuring. When conflicts arose, the call for more research became a tool to delay action indefinitely. Meanwhile, products stayed on shelves, advertising continued, habits deepened. The model was exported globally. Developing nations were urged to modernize, framing traditional diets as primitive. Global brands moved in, and within a generation, the same health patterns emerged. Imagining alternatives grew difficult. The system was totalizing, shaping availability, institutions, media, memories, and even taste buds. Palates, calibrated to intense, engineered flavors, found whole foods bland and unworthy. Nutrition education taught label reading and calorie counting, not systemic critique. It never suggested that the need for such defensive eating itself was evidence of a broken system. Parents trying to opt out faced powerful currents: peer pressure, school menus, social events. Complete isolation was nearly impossible and often backfired as children later sought the normal foods they'd missed. The economic logic was brutal and decisive. Whole foods were perishable, costly, and risky. Processed foods were durable, transportable, and profitable. The system optimized for economic incentives, not health outcomes. By the time evidence became undeniable, generations had adapted. Rising rates of obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome were no longer alarming. They were the unremarkable landscape of modern life. This was never just about food. It was a blueprint. Similar patterns reshaped how we move, rest, and connect. The model proved its value, not for human well-being, but for other priorities. It learned to wear the language of health while serving a different master entirely. And that pattern didn't stop there.